Recently, I had the pleasure of talking with Martin Billheimer, author of a new book about a dark chapter of Chicago's history that the Chicago Tribune writer Rick Kogan called one of the most revelatory, provocative, frightening books I've ever read about Chicago. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. Martin Billheimer, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Oh, well, that's very nice of you to say. An honor to me was reading your book, which we'll get to in a minute. It is called Mother Chicago, Truant Dreams and Specters Over the Gilded Age. First, I want to go into a little bit of your backstory, if we may. Tell me a little bit about your connection to Chicago, where you grew up, all of that exciting stuff.
Yeah, I was born in Uptown in 1970, and my parents were involved in politics. Then, by true politics, I mean radical politics, street politics. They were worked on the Rainbow Coalition and the Poor People's Campaign during that time, with organizations like the Young Patriot Party, things like that, and the Black Panthers. So that was the milieu in which I was born. I spent the next period of my life in the north of England, a very industrial area. My parents moved there just on a whim that was very common during that time. And then I moved back to Albany Park in about 1981, something like that, just at the dawn of the Reagan-Thatcher era. And I've been here ever since. I've lived in Logan Square, various places around Chicago.
I have a copy of your bio, and it says, there's a bunch of stuff that I thought was interesting. It says you founded the semi-notorious noise punk band Devil Bell Hippies in 1983. You were all of 13 years old at the time?
Yeah. I was an early achiever or early failure, I think is the better word for that. Yes, all of 13 years old, I founded this clattering ensemble that is still officially around and still produces fugitive recordings every now and then when I can get my friends to agree to something like that.
And did you have an instrument of choice, or you were just throwing metal garbage cans down the stairwells?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Exactly what it is. You've nailed it right on the head. I could not describe it better. Yes, exactly.
Pretty great. So yeah. Albany Park, I know based on your bio, you dropped out of high school. Did you go to Roosevelt? Yeah. Where did you go to high school?
No, I went to Lincoln Park, actually.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my mom went there when it was Waller. Too. And I was there actually, probably a few months into sophomore year, and then I dropped out. I found that high school was getting in the way of my education. So
I think that's a common narrative with, educated people who don't find school all that constructive. I'm guessing that was cool with your parents at the time?
Yeah, I had to get a job. That's what my mom said, all right, well, then you're working, which was fine. So I worked in various restaurants and sort of construction and, that kind of low paid, but pretty amusing work if you're young. The older you get, the less amusing it becomes.
Yeah. I mean, your bio says you worked as a dishwasher, a house painter, a construction worker, furniture movers, all jobs using your hands. Were you writing at the time as a kid? Did you write in your off hours, or did that come later?
Yeah. I did little bits of things. I did sort of essays and that sort of stuff were published in smaller magazines. A lot of them I just published myself. Mimeographed zines was sort of a big thing at that time. I think it probably still is. So I would send those out through the mail. I don't have them anymore. They're long gone, which is good. They were basically sort of lunatic parodies of things. And
I have friends who did zines back in the 80s as well, a lot of music zines, and you know, they held on to them, and every once in a while they'll put them on social media, which is always funny. And I think they also use the word mimeograph, which, you know,
Mimeograph,
people
exactly.
under a certain age just don't think to use the word mimeograph. So let's get to your book. Again, it's called Mother Chicago: Truant Dreams and Specters Over the Gilded Age. This book, after having read as many countless dozens of history books, which are usually kind of formatted the same way, yours caught me off guard, to be honest, because it is written with such an imaginative flourish, if I may, that I thought, oh, well, this is a whole new way of looking at the history of these places. Some of them that I was familiar with, many aspects of them, you know, I didn't know as much about. The book discusses, among other things, the Chicago Parental School, the Chicago Municipal Tuberculosis Sanitarium, that's easy to throw out, and the mental health hospital out near Irving and not quite Harlem, known to many as Dunning. What drew you to these very dark parts of Chicago's history?
Initially, physically, because we broke into the parental school, which is the most obscure out of the three. Every now and then, I still meet somebody that spent a small amount of time there. It was a sort of oddie home, but for the most part, people were only there for 3 to 6 months, things like that. It stood on just off Foster Avenue on what is land owned by Northeastern now, a very Gothic building. Huge, 4 or 5 huge, very heavy looking structures that were in decay at that time. Red curtains hanging out of them. It really looked like the set of a horror film, like a Hammer or a Roger Corman horror film or something like that. So we would walk by it every day, and I became obsessed with it like kids at that age do. I was about 11, I think, the first time. So years later, we finally broke in. The first time I broke in, I got caught and busted by the campus cops. But years later, we did manage to get in. We walked around it, which to me was an extraordinary experience. The tuberculosis sanitarium is right near there, not even a mile away. And I had walked by that before. There was only, the buildings have been converted to, I think, senior citizens' homes, but there were these sort of ruined shacks. I think all of those are gone that were sort of on the periphery with various beds. I suppose I've always been drawn to places like that. A lot of us urban kids, I think, are. There's a romance in it. To use a better word.
You actually have a line toward the end of your book that I think is a great lead-in to the story. So I'm actually going to jump ahead and then jump back. Not very linear at all. From 1890 to 1920, Chicago was littered with orphanages and industrial schools. The institutional pipeline began in the autumn of the Gilded Age with its unformed ideas of middle places and its snake oil sciences of moral correction. I mean, that nails the book on the head, right? It's so many stories, so many people who got involved in these places, and some of them may have had good intentions, but just went about things in such a horrible way. And so it was almost tough to read the people that you could see. You mentioned this guy, Thomas Sachs, who,
yes,
you know, I think had really good intentions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Making something good happen. And spoiler, he was kind of shown the door and had a horrible reaction to that parting.
Yeah, by the machine. Yeah, exactly. They had used his institution as a way to milk hires out of the state, and
Yeah, there was, a fair amount of, again, shocking being in Chicago, the amount of cronyism that happened, all the way back then. The Chicago Parental School, which you mentioned, opened in 1902. By 1906, was being investigated for corruption. So not even 4 years later.
Yeah.
The superintendent, McQuarrie, you wrote, had a blasé attitude toward the scarlet fever outbreak. You got to love people who don't take outbreaks seriously.
Exactly.
Not that anything recently has happened that's gone. But this guy had also taken 31 tons of coal meant for the facility and had it brought to his own private home. So classic guy.
The cheapness of that echoes any number of local politicians that obviously never pass up a chance to make even the smallest amount of money. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, yeah. But, you know, you mentioned, obviously this wasn't strictly a Chicago thing. You mentioned in 1879, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, where
that is the most brutal.
Yeah, believed Native American children could not be civilized while wearing moccasins and blankets. Their hair needed to be cut a certain level.
It's the uniform is curious, right? Because everybody has to look exactly the same, and long hair then as now was seen on Indians as a form of degeneracy, as if they were devolving back after being shown the marvelous fruits of civilization that, you know, the Indian removal and genocide.
And certainly the idea that you know, the white man of the time thought, well, our way is the best, and you're going to have to adapt to it, and that's how it's got to be.
Assimilate or die.
And unfortunately, many times they did. You also talk about, if I understood it correctly, cows at the Chicago Parental School, which had become infected with tuberculosis, but still weren't being shuffled off. So, you know, if you want to talk a little bit about that, that was another one of those things where I was like, oh boy.
It's the infected cows apparently ended up, I think, at Armour, if I remember right, in the book, which was at that time the stockyards were being investigated for fraudulent and also serially unhealthy conditions. And those cows were sort of traced and then traced back to the parental school, where they were finally executed. There's a very bizarre newspaper passage that describes their execution. It was one of the many, as you said before, constant investigations into what was going on at the parental school, where its funds went, and less so, but occasionally its brutal practices.
The the brutal practices, it's ongoing throughout the book, and it's unfortunate that a lot of the brutal practices obviously involved kids. You know, the parental school was made to help with kids in truancy, or kids who maybe were orphans and needed somewhere to go, or just needed corrective action. But the corrective actions were maybe a little extreme. You know, you mentioned, oh gosh, you had a great line I wrote down here. Deaths that were covered up, then uncovered. So there were a handful of deaths that were quickly kind of, you know, swept under the rug. And then, of course, a little while later would come out like, well, you know, he might have been beaten. He didn't fall from a tree and land on his head. He was beaten. I forget the name of the kid, James Wright, I think it was.
And Orville Vardaman was another one.
James Wright, I think, hung himself in Orville Vardaman, and you know, all these horrible things that, of course, now wouldn't pass, but yet somehow then swept under the rug, you know, and it went from person to person. You know, that should have been in charge and should have been taking care of these things. That
they tend to, the forces that be tend to oscillate somewhere between covering up and actual participation. The covering up happens when some embarrassing situation occurs and it actually goes to court, which it did in those cases. So and then starts a very long process of covering up. But the birth of the institution in a kind of cadet military style necessitates those murders, actually. And I think that they are not so much aberrations as the logical end of schooling and discipline systems like that, orphanages, and especially, say, the Indian schools, things like that. The crime is the point.
Well, the number of places, you on one page have a list of all the different orphanages and places that were designed to help kids and families back then. And it was kind of amazing. One of the things that drew me to this book, my dad was adopted. Actually, both my parents were adopted. And I asked him at one point, so do you know anything about your birth family? And he said, no, he was adopted at under the age of 2 from the Home for Unwanted Children. And I said, oh, it couldn't have been called that. And he said, I'm pretty sure it was. And I said, oh, maybe that's what they referred to it, but I can't imagine there was a place called that. And yet, you've got places, one of the places is was referred to as School for the Feeble-Minded.
Yeah, exactly. That's even worse than unwanted children, if there can be such a thing.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of episodes ago, I talked about a guy who was a convicted murderer who had spent time at the home. He called it the Home for the Friendless Boys, and it turns out it had a bunch of different names.
Yeah.
But you hear Home for Friendless.
Yeah.
Home for Unwanted, Friendless, like, oh boy.
There's a very strange honesty in those almost gothic sounding titles for institutions. They do sound like there's something out of Charles Dickens or something like that.
They could really use a marketing person to maybe kind of rework
soften that. And I suppose right, soften it. I suppose that's what we get today. We get more softened titles for places,
and maybe to your point, there is such an honesty about calling them, Home for Friendly, Home for Unwanted, Home for Feeble-Minded. Like, boy, there's no doubt as to what we're talking about there. But
that just screams eugenics, doesn't it?
It really does. I don't want to give away too much of the book. I found it fascinating in so many ways, and I can tell it's a good book when I kept having to stop and jam a bookmark in your book and then go to the internet and look up something, because you brought up so many things that even me, a big history nerd, thought, well, I don't know enough about this, and I need to know more right now, and I need to have it drilled down, quickly.
Thank you. That's more than kind. Yeah.
Another great line. I don't want to give away all your good lines, but one was in talking about the problems with tuberculosis. Germs move like, I'm going to try again. Germs move like vagabonds looking for their promised kingdoms, questing in crowded tenements and drawing magical spells from unclean water. Again, I read a lot of history books, and none of them have such a great turn of phrase like this here.
Thank you.
You primarily talk about the 3 key places. You also allow for descriptions of areas like Bubbly Creek, which I don't care who's talking about it. It makes my stomach churn a little bit.
Yeah, it's revolting. There's no question about it. Yeah.
So for people who don't know what Bubbly Creek is, I'll let you explain that a little bit if you like.
Basically, it was a sort of a runoff for animal fat, carcasses, all other kinds of offal from the armor plant. And later on, it morphed into, actually not even later on, but quite early after that, the machine and also various mafias started dumping bodies in it. And it still has a reputation as a place to go if you want to get rid of somebody that you've just gotten rid of. So, which was certainly the case then. I don't know if it's still used for that purpose, but I imagine it probably is.
You kind of hope that it's not, but when you talk about the animal
Dark
carcasses
places
that caused, the name Bubbly Creek, the animal carcasses as they decomposed bubbled up to the surface, and then eventually
there was
so much gross stuff that it would catch fire, and the fire department would have to come in and put it
right. I forgot to mention that. That's true. So you have the unnatural, spooky image of fire traveling over water and a layer of fat underneath it. It sounds like some sort of black magician's paradise, really, doesn't it?
I'm getting queasy again.
It's revolting. It's revolting. You're absolutely right.
Well, you also, you don't talk just about the places, but also the events of the time, including the Red Summer of 1919. It's, I mean, really, there were so many great things about it. I've got pages and pages of notes that I scribbled, and there were times that I didn't have enough light. I'd have to run over and get a light so I could scribble it out there. How much time did you spend researching, putting this together from the first moment you put pen to paper until when we got the copy of the book published?
I would say so. Well, maybe about 3 years. It could have been closer to 4. I was helped very much by Christina Ward of Feral House, who sort of said, "Okay, well, we have a book here, and you better get on writing it." I'm a very lazy person, so I need help in many ways. I need a lot of help. So, yes, I'd say about 3.5 years, maybe 4 years, something like that. I mean, not nonstop, but for the most part, yeah.
And Christina, by the way, who I have to thank for putting us together, from Feral House, your publisher, very persistent. She wanted to make sure that we had a chance to talk, and I'm glad our schedules finally aligned. Did she have an idea for a book about Chicago and put it in your hands, or did she say, "Hey, I want a book from you"?
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
Exactly. She sort of talked me through it. She said, I I had written book reviews for Counterpunch online, sort of art books, things like that. And that is how I got in touch with her. So she said, "Well, I think you should write a book." And we talked about various subjects, and then I figured that it should probably be something close to my heart, which is, Chicago. And she's a brilliant writer and author, publisher herself. So she was able to completely walk me through it, push me through it, and we talked about it the entire process. She was extremely generous.
Was this one of those things where you had a deadline of like a year ago and you kept extending it, or
yeah, I did. I did. I got a couple which I missed, and then I finally the line was drawn and said, "Okay, you have to meet this," which I did. I actually met the deadline. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I was at a bookstore in Roscoe Village a couple weeks ago, and I walked past the Book of Chicago Books, and there were a couple copies of your book, and I quickly sent Christina a message the next day and said, "Hey, I just saw Martin's book on the shelf here." And
oh, that's great. That's
she
fantastic.
said, "Oh, I always appreciate sightings of our books in the wild."
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think it's really made it, once I start seeing them in thrift stores, which
already in thrift stores? Like
no, I haven't yet.
Okay.
But I really think because probably like you or most people in Chicago, that's where I used to buy all my books, especially when you're a kid. So I would be deeply honored to see a copy of it in.
Well, you have to at least figure somebody's read it and then has been eager to get a couple bucks out of it.
Right. Pass it on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm guessing you researched this all around the Chicago area. Do you have a few key sites that you spent time at?
I would say it was a lot of them I had done in the past. So in some ways I was dealing with how I remembered them. Yeah, I did take the bus and return to them in the present, but I was more interested in between the tension of what one remembers and what, if anything, existed there. There's nothing left of the parental. There's just a strange sort of ditch in the middle of the northeastern campus. But I actually did not want to do too much of that. I wanted some way to deal with the way that people remember places. So I thought I should not exempt myself from that. I shouldn't exempt myself from bad memories or fantasies or inventions either. So, because I think we live, that is the far closer way that we live. Our research into everyday life, all of our research into everyday life is pretty eccentric. It flips back and forth in time. So I wanted to mirror the way that I said that, at the risk of sounding pretentious. I wanted to go through the book the same way.
And as for the background stuff, I saw Soldier Library, which is my local library here.
All right. Used to be the Hill, do you see? Yeah.
Yeah, were you
Yeah.
right exactly before it became the Old Town?
Yeah.
Were you, Newberry Library, Chicago History Museum?
Yeah,
I'm guessing
Chicago History Museum I went to, and the archives at Northeastern. There's very little about this stuff. There's some material on the sanitarium. There's almost nothing on the parental school, and a lot of the stuff I culled from old newspaper articles, actually,
Sure.
that were kind of a wealth of information, and also very strange. It's very strange, the act of reading in the past, or reading about the past, about things you're thinking about in the future. It gives you is rather schizophrenic. It's strange. Sometimes you don't really know where you are, which I kind of liked too. It's all about
I
finding
spend a
your
lot
way.
of time in that realm.
Mm.
So
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Am I describing that accurately, or?
Oh no,
What do
no.
you mean?
I think you have it spot on. I mean, there are days that I spend, digging through old newspapers online, and then when I step away from the computer, I have that moment of like, wait, what? Like,
Yeah, it's
have I eaten
spooky, isn't
today?
it?
Did I bathe?
Yeah.
Did I, like?
Yeah, it's very very spooky, and not unpleasurable, I guess. And I suppose even when you're not looking at old things, one is kind of, at least your subconscious is doing it when you're walking up and down the street. You have memories of places in your own life, but also things that you read somewhere, or things that other people have told you, say, that happened on this street corner, blah blah blah.
Well, so you mentioned, it being not unpleasurable. Um, during the past bit of crazy over the past, 18 months,
Hmm.
20 months, did you find some amount of solace in working on this, or?
Yeah, it,
I'll
no,
take
it's a
that
good,
as a strong no.
no, it's a good question. Actually, it didn't make any difference. Not the pandemic. I mean, there's terrible things going on around you and all that sort of stuff. But oh, yeah, the sort of the opioid feel of going over those things in the past. Yeah,
Yeah, or
I
just,
suppose
did it let you get out of your head for a little while?
Yeah.
During the quarantine to have this to focus on.
I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah. I know that when I'm working on kind of darker subject matter, it can kind of stay with me after I've walked away from it. Did you feel the same about this?
Not more so than anyone else would, or maybe not more so than somebody reading it or just thinking about it. I suppose maybe those subjects are kind of on my mind anyway, or maybe they're on all of our minds. So, yeah, again, I would say not particularly. No. I can never remember my dreams, so maybe that's I don't have that faculty. So maybe there's a bunch of it going on in there that's stayed beneath the eyelids. So
rattling around.
Yeah,
Again, I'd like to thank Christina Ward, the book's publisher, Feral House, for putting us together and getting me an advance copy. The book is called Mother Chicago, Truant Dreams, and Specters Over the Gilded Age. My guest today, Martin Billheimer, thank you so much for hanging out with me.
Oh, thank you for hanging out with me. It's been great. It's been an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.